everybody. It's just gone 12, so we'll get going. A few more may join us as we go because we've got quite a lot actually booked on this morning. But welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name's Georgia Turner. I'm an associate consultant here at Trueman Change, associate consultant for communications and engagement. We're really delighted you can join us today for this one of our regular change chats. Today subject is culture change. They are change chats, so they are designed to be interactive and to be pretty informal. So please post your questions, raise your hand, join the conversation, and we will actually be asking you for your thoughts as we go along as well. So yeah, get ready for that. We are recording. We'll share that with you afterwards on email and on the various Trueman Change social media platforms and YouTube and our website. So if you would rather not be seen in any recording, then please feel free to keep your camera off. I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Lucy Trueman today. Now, she's the founder of Trueman Change, and culture change, I would say, is what could be defined as Lucy's mastermind specialist subject. And so we're really looking forward to hearing what she's got to say about it over the course of the next hour or so. So at Trueman Change, Lucy, we've got quite a specific way that we look at and define culture change, haven't we? So I think it's probably a really useful starting point to kick off by asking you to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so our approach to culture is a version which comes from the work of Edgar Schein. So if you're a bit geeky like me and you're interested in the sort of foundations of what culture is, Edgar Schein is a really, really good place to start. And our working definition, so it is defined differently by different people, but our working definition is that culture is how messages are cascaded around an organization. And the reason we like that message is because it is more tangible and allows you to observe it in a more concrete way. Because one of the difficulties with culture is it does mean different things to different people. And what I see is people usually using it as a way to describe just behavior when it's actually much more complex than that. And people often describing it, almost always using it to describe behavior of a group of people over there. We're never talking about here. So normally when people say the culture is bad, they mean those people over there are not doing what I want them to do. So using the messages as a way of looking at culture removes some of the bias and it makes it more tangible, and it allows you to look at an organization and reflect on, okay, so what do some of these things that we do mean to people? What message is that sending out? And the other reason I like that definition is because you can train managers in it. So one of the really powerful things to do is teach your managers how to lead with culture in mind, and giving them something tangible and a way to look at that enables them to say, okay, I can see how that would send that message. I can see how that would send this message. Actually, if we change this, it will change the message that we're sending and therefore influence the culture. So it puts people in a much more proactive place of, rather than a complaining about people are behaving a certain way and I don't like it. So it's more objective, it simplifies it, and it enables you to teach your managers to lead with culture in mind. And we use it, as I said, it's a slightly simplified version. So Edgar Schein's work was about understanding the different levels of culture, and he described something called artifacts, which are things that you can see and observe in an organization, which again really plays into that, make sure it is something observable. And he had a range of different artifacts. We've simplified it into 3 groups. Just because when you're running a workshop where you're trying to understand culture, the vast majority of people are not as geeky as I am, and probably, no offense everybody on the call, but probably most people on the call, because you wouldn't be joining this call unless you were quite interested in culture. Most people aren't that interested in culture. So if you start with a workshop where it's quite complex and theoretical, you've lost most of the people in the room already. So we sort of slim it down to 3 key areas that we explore with people when we're doing culture mapping. So one is systems and processes, which is the most neglected one because people often, as I say, when they're talking about culture, they're very much talking about behavior and people. They're not thinking about, yeah, but we brought this IT system in that drives behavior in this way. We look at symbols and rituals, and that is the most difficult one to get a grip of because it's a bit fluffy and people don't always understand what it means. But it basically means things that could be symbolic, things that are habitual, things that go unchallenged. And then we do look at behavior. Behavior is a big part of culture, but it's only a part of it. It isn't the whole thing. And what we do is we run workshops with groups of people. I prefer them to be mixed. I prefer them to be of multiple levels, where you ask people for specific examples under each of those three headings. And then you are able to pull that together, do a thematic analysis on it, and then say, right, these are all the different messages you as an organization are sending to your staff, which is shaping the culture. And the magic is in looking for the contradictions. So if you are saying to your staff, we want you to be really innovative, but then you bring in an IT system that makes a process really lengthy and difficult, then you are sending a contradictory message there. And that's what I mean by, if you train managers in this concept of messaging and how that influences culture, you can then start to stamp out the contradictions to it. And then you can really proactively shape the culture that you want to see. But I'm curious, Georgia, because you're obviously coming at this from a comms perspective, which is more literal in a sense of what are the messages that we're sending. How do you define culture in that sense? Because you're at quite the literal end of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking about this in preparation for coming on this chat with you, and thinking that actually, when you take the definition without the explanation that you've just given, it feels like culture and comms are like that's it. And of course, comms, culture and comms should be like that. Um, but I think the fact that you've described those three elements, the systems and processes, the symbols and rituals, and the behaviors, um, is really interesting and really important part of kind of giving people license to talk about all the things influence how we do things around here. So that's basically
Yeah.
what it is, isn't it? How we do things around here, and how and when and what they even mean by round here. Do they mean my team, my desk? Do they mean the top of the organization? Have we got one culture? It's that panacea that organizations talk about.
Yeah.
And of course, comms has a role in formal messaging around that. This is,
Mm,
defining the culture that we want to see, the values and behaviors that we expect from people. But like you say, Lucy, I think comms leaders have, and internal comms colleagues in particular, kind of have a duty to push their senior colleagues around. Well, you're asking me to help shape a culture of creativity or innovation, but actually, the way that I'll take the IT example because that's where we started, but this IT system over here is the opposite of that. So
mm,
suddenly my formal message, my formal statement I'm making on behalf of the organization, it lacks credibility.
mm.
And as a communicator, the last thing you want to be doing is putting out messaging that doesn't have any credibility and doesn't feel authentic. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So
I think it's a blind spot for many organizations.
yeah.
They invest heavily in their comms and they do their comms well, but
Mm,
they have these contradictory messages going out in different ways because it's not an overall picture. And that's where you see you can't get the traction on the culture change because
yeah.
you're putting your money where your mouth is, in a sense. You
Yeah,
say the
absolutely.
right things, but driving behavior in other ways. But we can talk about lots of examples of where we might contradict ourselves accidentally.
Yeah, because I'd love to delve down a bit more. And I'm gonna. You said that the systems and processes are obviously most neglected. So let's not neglect them. Let's start with with those today. And I wonder if you can give us a little bit more, some practical examples, as well as a bit more theoretical perspective on what you mean by those and how and their role in culture change.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite everybody on the call, and you can take part to whatever extent you want with this. If you're happy to unmute and talk, that's fine. As we said at the beginning, it is recorded. If you'd rather just put something in the chat, that's fine. Or if you want to put something in the chat to me rather than to the whole group, then I can share that anonymously if you do feel that you'd rather stay anonymous, because I know some of this stuff can get a little bit deep. But what I'd like you to do is take part in this process as we go through, and actually you guys come up with some examples as well, because where it really brings it to life is when you think about your own organization, or it could be a previous organization that you've worked for, and you will start to spot some of these contradictions. And really it's that skill that we want to sharpen up. If you get good at spotting where we are saying one thing but we're sending a contradictory message, you will get really good at consciously shaping culture. Because the thing is, we are all shaping culture all day, every day, whether it's on purpose or not. And often it's quite by accident. So it's about getting that awareness. So please do take part in that. So the first category we're going to think about then is systems and processes. So that can be quite literally your IT systems. So I'm working with a council at the moment that wants to improve their efficiency, but actually their IT systems are quite poor. So again, we're saying to staff, you need to be more efficient, but we're actually pushing the behavior down quite an inefficient route because the IT system is so out of date. But it can also be processes. It doesn't have to be IT related, and it can be structures. And a really good question to ask when you're thinking about the systems and the process is, how do decisions get made around here? So again, if we're saying that we want a fast pace of change, but it turns out when we look objectively at how decisions get made, it can be through no end of all sorts of different kind of groups and meetings. You can see how that's a contradictory message. Also, how your decisions get made can contradict your organizational structures. So where you think the power lies, actually to really get decisions made, you go around things, and again, that is creating a certain type of culture. So have a think about, get your pen and paper and share if you're comfortable sharing, but have a think about, where have you seen in your current organization or a former organization or another client organization where systems and processes and the sort of harder stuff like IT, process maps, governance, decision making, where has that been at odds with what your organization wants to achieve? And I've got another example to share, which was, and I use this example a lot because it's a real blind spot one, and there's no judgment here. Like, none of these things are done on purpose. I know that. I've worked in this sort of work for a lot of years. It's very rare that you get people that are malicious. But in this particular organization, they wanted managers to be really empowered and to work alongside each other and across their own service areas a lot more. So they wanted to see more partnership working, less empire building. So there was a bit of a culture of empire building. When we started to dig behind the systems and the processes and how they were driving behavior, their job evaluation process awarded more points, which ultimately resulted in more money for depending on the size of team you managed. So you can see how that's a real interesting, completely accidental contradiction. We don't want you to empire build, but we're literally paying you to. So the bigger your team, the more money you get. And there's loads of really funny little blind spots like that nobody's really thought of in that context before. It was probably, that decision will have been made at a completely different point in time for all the right reasons. But yeah, please do share if anybody's got anything of where they can think of examples. And I don't know about you, Georgia, where you've seen examples of where systems and processes are driving culture in a certain way that might not be what was intended.
Yeah, I think one that's probably quite interesting and maybe a little bit unusual is when I was involved in effectively three councils merging into one organisation, one large unitary down on the south coast, and obviously there were three sets of systems in hundreds of different departments, and there'd been a lot of governance around creating the council because there's a hard and fast deadline and we had to be safe and legal on the go live date, and obviously there is a lot of governance around that to make sure that that happens. But the case for change that came with creating the council was around aspiration, freedom, economic viability. It was an exciting thing to be part of. So we were all kind of buying into this long-term vision of much more economic freedom, the chains from government, all that kind of thing, to make decisions quickly and be in charge of our own destiny as a kind of economic powerhouse in the south. But we were still operating in this place where people could sit next to each other because their teams had merged, but one was doing something on one system and the other one was doing something on another system, and they didn't talk to each other. So the kind of dream of where we wanted to get was, there was a lasting people, soon dropped off because actually their headache was right here and now. In my planning application can't even talk to your planning application, kind of thing. So yeah, it was. I mean, no, they're getting there now, but it takes years. This stuff, doesn't it? A really, really long time.
It can do, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the systems and process is often the neglected one in
Mm,
conversation about culture because it's different people. So you'll often have your culture people either sat in your change or transformation area, but often OD or HR.
mm,
Then you'll have your systemy stuff is all in IT. So the
yeah.
two are not even necessarily that connected. And it's a tough challenge. It's tough when I have to say to clients, look, you can bring me as a psychologist in as much as you want, but if you don't fix these contradictory messages, which might mean investment in your IT or it might mean changes in your decision making process, you are consciously putting out this or subconsciously putting out this completely contradictory message. And it's really difficult to resonate that because the answer to consciously shaping a good culture and shaping it in the way that you want it to be is to make sure that all these things are aligned. So it is a challenge, but I'm curious if anybody else has got on the call, if anybody does have any examples of where they've seen that, where they've seen that either a decision making process or a structure. Structure is a really tough one, and you can get lost in doing organizational restructures that don't necessarily change the behavior and cause a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of mess. And sometimes you can work around structures. Sometimes it is about relationships much more than it is about actual power and where it is aligned. But again, if you have got, people that are supposed to be accountable for stuff, trying to make decisions about stuff, but they don't actually have the power to make those decisions, then that's a really good example of where a structure might be contradictory to the sort of behavior that you want. But yeah, systems and processes, people don't necessarily want to think about when they think about culture. I do notice that there is when I do that section of the workshops, and I tend to do that section first because it's a nice warm up one. Because when you're doing staff workshops and you're not going into the theory of culture and you're there just to say, look, we need to understand what it's like to work here. Tell me how your systems and processes work, people just light up with feedback because there's nearly always just no end of examples of processes and systems in place that are making it difficult for people to do their jobs.
Yeah, and on that, right on cue, Stephen has put a really interesting point in the chat. Do you want to say any more about that, Stephen? Or
Well, it's up to you, really. I mean, it kind of
yes, please
it's
do.
fairly self-explanatory because um, we're a housing thing. We're set up to get kind of decent homes funding, but we've been kept because we we're seen as can do, and we do things that if we were within the council, we might not do. We run an art subsidiary for them and a drug recovery company and all kinds of things, but with the the move to a kind of a national housing regulator, the council are more and more concerned that they've kind of said, we want you shoulder length, not arm's length, which we're fine to work with to a degree, but ultimately, like I said at the end of it, if we were a kind of landlord services team within the council, we'd probably have less bureaucracy because there's so many ways in which we're being kind of almost not micromanaged, but more managed
Yeah,
than the kind of rationale we were set up for.
yeah. That is really challenging. We do a bit of work in housing, and we're doing a project at the moment, which is bringing an Almo has been brought back in house to a local authority, and we're having to work through some of those challenges of that changing culture. It is really difficult because the recent like increase in regulation in housing is putting a huge amount of pressure on, and this is a very weird coincidence, but had a long chat with our housing associate yesterday about what the cultural impact of that is. And it's a similar cultural impact, if you're not careful, to what we see in education and in social care with Ofsted, that you're often attracting people into the sector where they are very much motivated by making a difference, because that's why you would go into sectors like housing and social care. But then we're creating this really critical regulatory vibe of you can't make any mistakes, and people feel extremely judged. So you've got all that going on, and then when you've got the complexities of the relationship that you're describing with the council, I can absolutely see how it needs working through that in terms of where is it appropriate that you have increased scrutiny, because you've got to react as an organisation to that external pressure of that regulatory services that you can't control. So you have to be able to react and adapt to that. But how do you do that while keeping your culture innovative and positive and making a difference, where is definitely a challenge. And we do see that in other organisations as well, for sure.
Feel your pain, Stephen. I think that's what Lucy's saying.
Yeah,
We
it
feel
is.
your pain.
It is tough. And often you will have different cultures in councils than you have in housing organisations anyway. And one of the challenges where I think I might not be a majority voice in this, a lot of people try and push for a unified culture across an organisation. I actually don't think that's necessary or possible. And I think it's okay to have subcultures. It's okay to have different cultures, because you've got, particularly in local government, such a diversity in what it does anyway. Of course, you're going to have a different culture in housing services than you are in the legal team, and that's okay. So try not to get too sucked into we have to align everything, because I don't think you necessarily do.
Yeah, and Mathura has mentioned that kind of almost that classic element that you mentioned earlier, Lucy, around we want to be fast paced, we want to be agile, we want to be quick and move at pace. But guess what? Our approval processes are poor. Our systems don't let us do that, etc., etc. So a common problem. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything around that.
Yeah, I think it's the Goldilocks thing, isn't it? It's just getting the right level of what's the right level of governance and what is proportionate. And that requires, I mean, there's a whole fascinating, one of my favorite psychology concepts boils down to basically cats and cheese, and whether people are motivated by reward or whether they're motivated by risk. And that is an example of where that plays out, of are we going to focus here on the potential reward of being fast and agile, or are we going to focus on the risk of getting things wrong? And how do you create an environment that enables both of those needs to be met, rather than swinging like a pendulum? Because particularly in, as we just said, using housing as an example, the regulatory pressures there are huge. We have a responsibility as public bodies to do the right thing here and make sure we have a level of governance. But what happens is we swing between those two opposing forces instead of finding the sweet spot in the middle, which can be very challenging.
And that swings nicely in, actually, Lucy, to Laura Ann's point around workshops and activities that we might recommend to work out some of those processes and systems that you could really use to help change and impact culture positively.
So
that's one of them, isn't it?
I would start with the culture mapping workshop, which we run, which is where they normally run for about 2.5 hours, and you get a mixture of staff and you explore each of these issues. So I'm kind of running it with you guys now, of saying, okay, so tell me examples of where you're seeing this. Tell me examples of where systems work well, where they don't work well. And not necessarily doing that from a culture perspective. You are doing it from a culture perspective, but in terms of the workshop itself, it's almost a fact-finding thing. And then I honestly think, just go to the people on the front line. The people on the front line, they know how to make things better. They know what gets in their way. So working with those, and then there might be some tense and difficult conversations to be had higher up about, and that cats and cheese kind of way of framing that, it's actually called, the formal title of it is not cats and cheese, it's reinforcement sensitivity theory. But the theory is that we have different sensitivity to either risk or reward, but the cats and cheese brings in a playful element of that that enables you to describe and articulate that we have differences here. We have individual differences, there'll be organizational differences, there'll be differences within teams. So how do we have productive conversations where we figure out where we are on that instead of swinging like a pendulum? But you kind of need your facts first in terms of what are the things that influence that culture. I'm just conscious as well, if we missed is it pronounced Lucy? Because I've never seen Lucy spelled that way. I love it. But Lucy has described that working across different legacy systems. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is to come back to an anchor. So I did a project in adoption services, as in adopting children, not sometimes people think adoption services like IT adoption. But it was quite literally adopting children, and it was 6 different councils coming together to create a shared service. And I remember this one workshop, and I insisted that we had adopters in the workshops, which was a fight. People didn't want them there. And we were looking at a process, and across the 6 different councils, one of the sticking points for the staff was who answers the phone. So when a person has made that potentially, well, not even potentially, literally life-changing decision, I want to adopt a child, and they ring, who answers that call? Does it have to be a social worker or not? And this raging debate was had because there was difference of opinions as to who should take that call. And in the end, I called a close to it, and I asked the adopter in the room, and the adopter said, I do not care about the qualifications. What I need is empathy, because I might have just been around 4 rounds of IVF that failed when I pick up that call, and I'm scared. And it was such a beautiful moment of anchoring back to what is important. So I think when you're trying to marry up different views of systems, it's a good idea to have some principles at the start of that so for us, it was, we need to get children into adopted homes as quickly as possible. We need to operate with empathy, and it needs to be cost effective. So it just 3 or 4 things that whenever you're struggling with that, well, we do it this way, we do it that way, you've got them up on the wall to say, okay, this is our anchor, this is what we're trying to do. That would be my advice for stuff like that. And yeah, always have your customers in the room, because they're very good at bringing you back to what's really important.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. I'm just conscious of time, and because we could do this all day. Well, I know Lucy definitely could do this all day. But I'll move on to the second of the 3 around symbols and rituals, which to me sound much more tricky to define and also really interesting. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's really tricky to define, and the reason why it's tricky to define is because they're not always visible. So rituals is a bit easier. So if you think of rituals, like, we're not talking witchcraft, we're talking like what things happen regularly that people don't necessarily question. So a ritual might be the way that a meeting is run, or how often a meeting is run. Symbols can be things like, so one of my favorite things that I always notice when I go into, and I'm very blessed and lucky in my work, and I get to go to loads of different organizations, but even what I find interesting is when you go into the toilets, how many signs are there in the toilets telling you how to wash your hands, how to flush the toilet, to leave them in the state? Because those things, although they're fairly trivial, and when you work there, you almost don't even see them anymore, which is like, they're not going to necessarily change the behavior if nobody even sees them anymore, but they are sending a very paternalistic message. So it's about, how do rooms look? What are the habits that are constantly there? And the other really interesting part, which I know you probably know more than I do about, Georgia, is the storytelling. So what are the constant narratives and things that are said, and pay attention to that language. So this is a really good, in the workshop environment, I always ask people to tell me how long they've been where they are, because it enables you to spot, because the people that have been there a long time will find this question the most difficult. The people that are new won't. So when you say to a new person, what stories have you been told? when you first started here. That will give you a huge amount of information. And stories are a really interesting and powerful way of communicating, which often we neglect and forget about. So we've evolved to tell stories. We've evolved around the campfire. We've evolved passing on information. You know, we haven't had an intranet very long. We haven't had emails very long. So the concept of storytelling has been a huge part of our evolution as a species. And if you look at what phrases are constantly being used and what stories are being told, they are hugely symbolic of culture. So I worked with an organization who they were like a consumer body organization. And when I asked the question of the staff, what phrases do you hear often? They said, we're always hearing people say, but think of what that would look like in the Daily Mail. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And again, it's really important if you're going through this process that you do it without judgment, because none of these things are done on purpose. What it can do, though, is it can create inadvertently a very risk-averse culture. So yes, as political bodies, we have to be aware of how things might look in the media. But if that is a constant, repetitive story or narrative or phrase that you are saying to your staff all the time, then the indirect effect of that is that they become more and more cautious and risk-averse. So
Yeah.
it's about spotting the things that are not necessarily that obvious, which is why it's the most difficult one, but definitely speak to staff that have got a range of length of service, because the ones that are new will spot them much better than the ones that have been there a long time. The ones that have been there a long time will be great at systems and process and behaviour, but they'll struggle with this one.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example that you just gave, Lucy, because I think that I would like to think that the rationale for a question like that is because we're not doing the right thing. It would look bad because we're not doing the right thing, as opposed to it would look bad and I'm therefore worried about our reputation. That's the only driver of this. It shouldn't be the only driver. If you do the right thing, your reputation will be good by default. And if you tell the stories around doing the right thing, but like you say, that is all about having your who are your lead characters, who are your supporting characters, what's your beginning, your middle, and your end, how is that threaded through, and how are you making it relevant? I think one of the I wouldn't say problems with it's not a problem. We must have leaders in our organizations demonstrating their leadership, but sometimes organizational stories focus solely on the leaders, and that tells the story of a top-down organization sometimes, rather than actually how are the values and the behaviors being demonstrated and lived and brilliantly successfully with our services and our customers all across the organization at all sorts of levels. And quite often there seems to be a reluctance, or maybe organizations are a little bit scared of letting their people do that and showcasing that. And that does that have some trust issues or something like that. It tells you more than the line. That little line tells you so much, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. So again, I would invite everybody to have a think about your own organization or previous organizations and see if you can think of examples of phrases that are said or stories that are told and how that might be influencing your culture. And the other one, which I touched on at the start, is the rituals of meetings. So the same example of the organization that had the job evaluation issue, that were saying they wanted their managers to not be empire building and to work together more collaboratively. They had a habit of having their weekly directorate management meeting once a week, 3 hours, nobody that wasn't in their directorate in that room. So a huge investment of time, a huge message around not collaborating. And it came from a place of the directorate was children's social care, which, similar to what we were saying about housing, highly, highly regulated, high risk. So it came from a place of we need to be in grip and control and all of the right reasons. But you can see how, again, it's sending this message of, yes, we're going to say that we're going to collaborate with us, but when it comes down to it, we are shutting the doors and we are concentrating on working together as a team and not outside. Now, totally not planned in that way at all, but contradictory message. So think about the habits, the way your meetings are run, what the sort of meeting cycle is, and even things like how much people are in the office says something about the culture. Now, the jury's out for me, and I've done a lot on hybrid working. I ran a session a couple of weeks ago actually with a council with all their managers about how to understand and how to be a good manager in a hybrid working world. The jury is out. It's highly contextual, highly cultural, and there is not any research that is conclusive on it. And there are a lot of people that think there is, but there really isn't. And any piece of research that says what works well, there is a contradictory piece of research. We really just don't know yet. But that still tells you something about what the culture is like, because it does tell you. And that's not to say in some organizations, you know, a hybrid working works really well, home working works really well, in others, in office working works really well. But it's things like that and identifying the meaning behind them and come back to what message does that send? Because you don't have to be a psychologist to be able to determine the meaning in these things. It's just, what message is that sending? I'm going to shut up because I can see we've got quite a lot of chat stuff. And I think we've got a comment from Helen that we didn't actually answer on the systems one.
Oh, have we? Sorry, Helen.
So how have you balanced a situation where some teams are using more modern solutions, but there is resistance from others? We think it's a little of not knowing how to use them and fear of what people might think, but don't know for sure. You've got to talk to them and find out, I would say. I would just get a few in a room. I would not pick your easiest ones, because when we're dealing with resistance, it's easy to focus on the people that are not resisting. Pick your resistors, because your resistors aren't your biggest enemy. Apathy is your biggest enemy. If people are resisting, then they care. And if they care, then they've got an opinion and they want it to be right. It might be that the system isn't working for them for a particular way. It might be that they don't know how to use it. It might be that it's not solving a problem, or they don't trust it. But the only way you'll do it is by picking a few and really workshopping with them and going through it with them and making sure that it works for them. Generally, people, it's interesting, I could go around a whole tangent here, but change management as a discipline is fundamentally set up to focus on resistance as if it's a bad thing, and I really think it's not. I think it's a really good thing. I think if people are resisting, then they care, and generally that's telling you something, and those are the people you can work with. The biggest challenge to change is people that just don't engage with it. It's apathy, not resistance. But yeah, talk to them and see if you can figure it out. But what else have we got, Georgia? I know we've got a few questions come in.
Yeah, there's some quite interesting observations of a couple of cultures with, with phrases that then did manifest themselves through to culture, like, a well-known sports brand, like Just Do It. And someone else, Sam, has said the company culture was very much JFDI, which actually then, actually translated as proceed at all costs. So actually, it feels JFDI. Yeah, that feels kind of exciting and a little bit, innovative and all those things. But actually, where's the line that doesn't make it so polarized? And then I shared an example where I would hear the phrase "at pace" frequently in almost every meeting we must do this at pace, we must do that at pace. But like I say, in almost every meeting we were in, there were lots of governance, there was lots of process. Literally nothing happened at pace because the reason people weren't making progress at pace wasn't because they didn't want to, because they didn't care, or because they were resisting making decisions at pace. It was going back to that, really the previous one around systems and processes, as well as, but the message. So there's a real contradiction there. And then there's some comments, David. I don't know if you want to have a chat about this or not, but around when you feel personally that you're no longer aligned with your organizational culture, and have you got any tips around what people can do to kind of overcome that or address it in their organizations?
Yeah, I don't know about tips to overcome it. I mean, the way that it sort of went from a company where you felt you were sort of encouraged to challenge and you felt comfortable to challenge, and the cynical people like myself, it was welcomed as like a challenge, and to a sort of bit of a JFDI culture where you felt that if you did challenge, then you weren't seen as somebody that was for the business, and people that sort of said what people wanted to hear were the people that then seemed to get on within the business. And yeah, it was really strange over a long period, over the last like 10 years working there. I felt the change, and I felt I was no longer comfortable in that company.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it
Well,
was a really strong cultural company as well. And I've now moved to a council, and I'm struggling to find culture. It's strange. Yeah, I mean, we've got values, and you see them all written down, but I don't know if we meet them. And it's quite interesting from a company where I felt part of the culture, and I was recruited as part of the culture. I've still not found it in my new job. I quite enjoy working there, and it's quite a nice place to work. But I don't feel, I don't know, I don't feel it's like it's my company. You know what I mean? It's really
yeah.
mm,
Yeah. Well done for making the brave choice.
mm,
Because I do think life is too short that if you feel that you're working in an organization that isn't aligned with you, then and a lot of people talk about stress meaning different things to different people. And actually stress isn't necessarily always about workload. People make the assumption that it's about workload, but it is very often as a result of that mismatch that you don't feel that your values are aligned. That is much more stressful to us as people than having a lot of work to do. So well done for making the brave choice there. I think in a council, it's interesting that you say you don't feel the culture, because I think that probably comes back to what I was saying earlier about councils are so diverse in what they offer that they often have a lot of subcultures. So there isn't necessarily always that one story, that one identity pulling it all together. There's been a lot of work done over the years by councils to try and tackle that, and often by doing things like putting values on the walls. And I'm not going to say values aren't important. Truman Change is a very values-led company, but we have done a lot of work to really embed. So even when we do our goal setting, we base it around our values. When we get customer feedback, we base it around our values. So it's really, really embedded. Most councils have not done that level of work. And I question again, and I am an outlier in this, there's a lot of people in this industry that do a lot of work to bring that together. For me personally, I wonder, is that a bit of a red herring and a bit of a waste of time? And is it okay to accept? So I would focus on how you can shape the culture within your team and your
yeah.
area.
Yeah,
Rather
and yeah, I
than
mean, as a council, we've just revisited all our values, and it's literally been republished within the last few months. So I am watching with interest as to how, whether it was just this wonderful cultural exercise and then they'll be ignored, or whether we actually live by them going forward. And we've had a new chief exec, so things are in the change at the moment as well. So it'll be interesting to watch how it goes over the next few months.
yeah, definitely. Sounds like an exciting time.
Definitely.
And interesting to know whether, because quite often that is often a driver of a kind of cultural review piece, isn't it? Is new organisational leadership or some kind of organisational trauma, like you say, Lucy, you've had a really bad Ofsted in a particular department or something. Well, obviously in education or something like that. But it's whether or not they've taken that time to do the listening around where's our starting point here, not just where do we want to be, but where are we starting from, and actually, is it broken? What's wrong with it? What's working well? What do we want to hold on to? Because it's unusual for it to be all bad. There will be what's are the good things and the good practice and the good cultural pockets here that we actually might want to mirror. And one of the things I've been kind of pondering on, and it kind of links to what you said, Lucy, just now around actually maybe it's okay to have multiple cultures, is where does culture really come from? Does it come from your leaders at the top? Does it come from your micro teams at a very operational level? I mean, I'm sure actually it's all of the above, but it's all, maybe that's a debate for another day, I don't know, but I just find that quite interesting. Like, where does it come from really?
It is all of the above, and that's why I like that definition of it's how messages move around,
Yeah.
because that enables you then, and values on the wall is a form of messages that are being moved around. So the challenge is, it's the same challenge as it is with culture. So where are we contradicting them and where are we not? It is the case of, if you consider culture as there's all these different ways we can put those messages out there, do they all align, and are we as leaders making sure that they are aligned in a way that creates the sort of culture that we want to see? That's how I think culture is created. There is one more on the symbols before we move on, because I'm conscious we are going to run out of time.
Yeah.
But there is another question on symbols which I think is useful to ask yourself, and that is, how is success celebrated? Because that sends out a huge message in terms of, this is what we value. So when something is held up as, this is a good example, how do we actually celebrate that? And often when I ask that question in staff workshops, the answer is we don't, which is we're missing such a trick there of really being able to shape culture in quite a powerful way, because it's such a powerful message to celebrate success.
Yeah, and going back to the storytelling, that's such a rich source of positive cultural stories for your organization as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so as you said, yes, conscious of time, and we've almost gone back full circle to the kind of how people tend to describe culture, which is the behaviours of those people over there and what they do and how they behave. So, do you want to talk us a little bit more through some of those theories and examples that are very evident around how behaviours influence culture?
Yeah. So behavior is the most obvious one. So this is the one that we probably need to spend the less time on anyway.
Yeah.
But I think that, so some of the questions we ask about behavior is we ask quite literally, how do we see people behave? And people sometimes struggle with that as a big opening question, but often we'll get some stuff. Then we ask, how do leaders behave? Because then we can get a sense of the leadership and where the power is and how those people behave. We ask, how do we behave when we disagree or when we're in conflict? So that gives a huge amount of information in terms of what the culture is like. So when people say things like, well, we never disagree, then I think, oh, that's a bit of an unusual situation. So that means that people don't feel safe to disagree. When people say, well, we don't manage to resolve anything, and they just sort of everybody goes back into their own, then that tells you something about behavior there as well. The how we celebrate success can overlap into behavior as well, but it is just that getting the observable things of what do you see people doing and how they behave and what are the relationships. So another question is, how do we connect? How do you connect with each other? So people there will often talk about things like, well, we speak mostly on Teams or we speak mostly at meetings, which again, all of these categories overlap. So that can tell you something about rituals as well. But observable behavior and making the distinction between staff and managers is important. What you then tend to find, so common things that don't necessarily mean anything, is we have like a preference to proximity as humans. So we tend to feel closer to the people that we work with most, and then we tend to create a bit of an us and them with other parts of the organization. So stuff like that, pinch of salt, but dig a little bit and see if it is more meaningful than that. But most people, I mean, they do say people join a company but leave a manager. So your proximity to the people that you work with, and the fact that we're tribal creatures by nature, so we sort of have our team, and that's a different team, and we very naturally fall into all that. But that does need looking at. But it is really just looking at what do you see people behaving and what's the difference between staff and managers, and you will see some of those contradictions there for sure.
Yeah. And what do you think about, because quite often we measure those in large organizations, don't we, through things like staff surveys, um, and that kind of quantitative snapshot at a moment in time.
I mean, I'm all for staff surveys. I'm not against them at all. I do really think I would never, and I've looked at this from a business point of view, I've looked at this. Is there a way of turning our culture mapping into some sort of staff survey? And absolutely, it's doable. But I just feel, and I as a psychologist, I have a real preference towards qualitative stuff, and I know that that might be a bias in me, but I just feel like the importance of actually spending time in a room full of people and really understanding the richness of it is very, very powerful. So I do think staff surveys are important, but I consider them as a pulse point. I don't think that they change. I think that when we run culture mapping, even just running those sessions themselves makes a difference. I think that moves people on that change journey. And I think we try to electronify that. And there are things out there that I've looked at from a business point of view. Would I want to sell this? And the answer is, well, yeah, it'd be profitable, but I don't believe in it. And I think those electronic versions. So I would use a staff survey, and I always ask my clients, have you done a staff survey? Can I have a look at it? Because it gives me a starting point. But I don't think it does the real cultural healing work, and it is often healing work. that actually getting people in a room and discussing some of these things and teaching managers how to spot them and how they can use that to influence, I think we'd be at risk if we sort of digitize that. Maybe I'm being really old-fashioned there, though, and I'm
No, I
that.
agree. I think there's a place for quantitative work, but I agree it's a moment in time. It is that pulse. You know, what experience have people just had when they fill it in quite often can influence, and because you get the numbers, you take it as read that actually it's representative, but doesn't necessarily mean that is the case. And like you said, the qualitative piece, quantitative tells you what people think, qualitative can get you down to the whys, you know, the real depth of why do you feel that way, what's driving it, what has to change, what are the solutions, rather than just I'm going to be my keyboard warrior, fill in my survey and get it all out, you know, and give them a bad score, you know.
The other risk is it takes away the richness, because as we've said, it's really common for there to be pockets of different types of culture. And when we run culture mapping sessions, as part of the introduction, I say, you are going to have different responses to some of these questions, and that is okay. I need to hear those differences. The differences are really important. So I think that sometimes surveys can, because then you look at, well, 80% of people think this or 20% of people think that. And I've literally just this morning recorded a video about the 80-20 rule, saying it's a good rule to have to focus your energy. And I stand by that when you're talking about processing and process maps. But when you're talking about culture, you need to understand the richness of the difference. And I don't think that's always possible. There are tools that measure, and there are tools that ask pointed questions that then they do the work for you in terms of what might that mean, which, you know, maybe there is a market for those, but I personally just think the richness and it's the healing, and they do feel like they're healing. What I would say is, if you're thinking of doing this, don't do it unless you're going to do it properly, because if you do get people in that room and you do get people talking about some of their challenges, for them to go away and feel like nothing has been done with that is damaging. It will make the culture worse. So when we do it, if you're serious about we're on this journey and we want to make things better, don't do it as a tick box exercise, which sometimes staff surveys can be a bit of a tick box exercise.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point around making sure you follow up on it, because I know certainly in organisations I've been at before, where you start to see response rates to those surveys go down, because the language, the storytelling isn't coming out of those surveys to say, this is where we acted on what you told us. You said you wanted to see this change. This is how we're addressing it. This is what we're doing. Here is the impact on real staff, real people. And that it seems to me to be quite infrequent to get that really, really right and demonstrate that. I've just got one. Sorry, go on, Lucy.
I was just going to add that another thing that we probably should have talked about under the like symbols and rituals part is myths. And actually, we're working with a client at the moment where there is this view that the customer standards are very low, and there is this view that they have a high turnover of staff. And actually, when you look at the facts and you benchmark it against other organisations, both of those things are untrue. So the perceptions that are being told as stories that are moving around the organisation, or that staff turnover is really bad. No, it actually really isn't. You're much better than the national average in your sector. So looking for myths is important. And again, if you rely on these sort of one-way electronic forms of communication with staff, you're not having the opportunity. Now, when I do culture mapping with that organisation, I can say, are you aware? Because I know this is coming up, but are you aware this is the national average and this is where you are? So you can do some of that like work within the sessions of doing some of that myth busting, which is powerful.
So there's a place for that quantitative stuff. It's just getting it in the right place. And Rebecca said she finds particularly highlighting differences between different types of staffing group, for example, full-time and part-time staff. You know, if there's a marked difference in a number of key indicators there, that's something you can't ignore and you shouldn't ignore. But you might want to follow up with some qualitative culture work to see how you fix that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. It looks like Helen. I was going to say there's one more question, but it's Helen, and she's off. So she's off to celebrate the success of one of her team passing an apprenticeship with merit. Well, that's a lovely thing to almost finish on. So enjoy that, Helen. Okay, we're nearly at the end. Before I draw us to a conclusion, I don't know if anyone had any further comments they wanted to add, or Lucy, you wanted to wrap up with anything in particular?
Well, I'll just share a link in the chat, which is we've got a page about culture mapping on our website with a bit of a video there, which probably you don't need to watch the video because I've probably gone into a lot more detail at this. And we do have our next event, which is about improving services. So that's very much around if you're going through any sort of service redesign, that would be a great event. I am doing market research at the moment in terms of I am going to be running an event in probably April or May about change and transformation, probably focused on local government, but open to it being wider than that, where we look at, so one of my kind of obsessions at the moment is that we've created an industry around doing change and transformation, which is dominated heavily by project and program management. And I'd really like to run an event for people to come, bring a team, bring a problem or a change that they're working on at the moment. And then we look at that problem from other perspectives besides project and program management. So look at it from a cultural perspective, look at it from a psychology perspective, look at it from a resident co-design engagement perspective. So to pull us out of this, we've got to do a project plan. Not saying that project management doesn't have its place, but I don't think it's the be all and end all with change. So if anybody's up for have conversation about that and would like to, is interested to know more or to help shape that, because it is just a pilot event, then please do reach out, because that's something that I really feel quite passionate about. I think that the tides, my research from how change happened during COVID has really shown that, you know, this kind of very sequential planned approach is not necessarily the best way to do change. So I'm keen to explore that with interested people. So please do reach out if that's something that you're interested in.
Brilliant. That sounds super interesting. Thanks, Lucy. So thanks everyone. That went mega quick, that hour. So thanks for joining us. Hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you so much everybody for your participation. Thank you, Lucy, especially for your expertise. As Lucy just mentioned, our next change chat on service improvement is on the 6th of December. It's actually from 1 till 2 p.m. You can register in a normal way. Come along, bring a mince pie, as it will be December. I'm sure Lucy will have her Christmas hat on. We'll follow you up with an. No, she won't.
I'm a Halloween girl, me. I'm not a Christmas girl.
We'll follow up with an email link for this recording, so you can share it within your organisations if you'd like to. Please do. And as Lucy said, please reach out and chat to her or myself about anything you think we may be able to support you with. And thanks again for joining us, and have fabulous afternoons, everyone. Take care.